And we're back. So 3 people already. Oh, eager beavers. Fantastic. 5 people. I do like the countdown. I was just everybody who's just joining, I was just explaining to Kieran that yeah, you can change the intro thing, which we are in the process of doing. So we've got somebody who's contributed a little jingle of music, and we're getting a little cartoon to like do as an intro so that we can stop having me rambling at the beginning like this. While we're waiting for people to turn up. That's literally the only reason.
Are we live? Can you tell me if we're live? Are there comments?
Well, then, yeah, because there's 15 people. At least I can see that there's people there. But
No, that's good.
feel free to say hello, 15 people. We will do introductions in a moment, just so I don't end up repeating myself. But that's why the cartoon would be great, because the cartoon's going to be about maybe 2 minutes long, I think, so people can get in, get settled.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, it's great. It's fun. I do like this service. Oh, yes, there we go. Alice. Hello, Alice. Hello, Tanya.
Oh, it just all popped up.
James, Laurel. Fantastic. That was very squeaky and exciting.
I want a little cartoon for when I just meet people randomly.
Okay, we can do that.
Be good.
Hello,
Just
Lisa.
play it, and then you never have to talk to anyone.
Well, this is the thing. When I have meetings and they are neurotypical and they do the frustrating thing, which they don't, you know, it's not like they're being mean or anything like that, but like, how are you? And they've literally never met me.
Yeah.
And then I go on for about 5 or 10 minutes about why that is really awkward and uncomfortable.
So now you can just have a cartoon to play about why it's really awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah. So don't
Yeah.
ask. Yeah.
Save your spoons.
Fantastic.
We should just have cartoons for everything.
Well, I do like the cartoon apps. They are very fun. I'm making my one for the Pride that we're doing the session. So we've got a number of fantastic things from different Aucademy peeps who've made things for us, which is great. Lots of people coming in. Lovely. Jude, Louise, Alison, Ruth, and Victoria. Can you see the comments, Kieran?
I can, yeah.
Yeah. You don't have to. You can hide them if you like.
It's fine.
But I will do the introductions in a second. And Sky is going to be in the background. Oh, I can hear myself echoing. That's annoying. Why am I echoing? Hold on, I'm just double checking in case I've got it open somewhere else. Anyway, no, it's on my device. Sorry, fantastic 23 people listening to me waffle. This is how we start Aucademy sessions, with the waffle. And now I'm thinking of waffles. But Sai will be Sai's kind of in the background, so Sai will grab any comments or questions that are useful and post them for us on the page on the screen so people can see them. And if people are new and don't tend to do lives or see lives, you can actually get the captions come up automatically now. So if you click on the wheel, the cog, the settings, and you can click captions, it does it automatically now, which is great, because you used to have to wait until the video had been up for a while.
Yeah, that was ages, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, okay, that's enough waffle of me now. So I am Chloe, and this is Aucademy, and today I am joined by Kieran Rose, also known as the Autistic Advocate. And we are doing a session on autistic masking, really. Like really, what is autistic masking? Mostly because Kieran loves masking, in the sense of talking and explaining and trying to destigmatize. I don't mean loves it and saying we should all be doing it.
I know
Definitely one of your dedicated interests, I think, fair to say. Yeah,
definitely.
And occasionally I might see something, and then Kieran and I might have a moan about how it's still perpetuating the myths about what masking actually is. So although Kieran has come on and spoken about masking and stigma before, we're doing it again because I got annoyed with a post that I saw recently, and Kieran was just as annoyed. So we thought we'd pick it apart.
To be fair, that's like a daily thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And before we came on, Kieran and I were explaining, like talking to each other about this as well, which is that it's not the people who are like sending out the messages about masking, like lovely, fantastic groups that are trying their best to help families, people who have only just realised they're autistic, to understand masking. So they're making lovely little infographics and things like this. And it's not their fault that they've got too narrow an understanding of masking. So Kieran and I we were talking about the issue isn't really them, it's that it's coming down from the literature, and the literature is getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Don't know if you want to say more about that.
No, I do. It's just that, and also then these little infographics and things which usually are skimming kind of surface truths, but don't, you know, it's an infographic, I can't go too deep, but usually it sends people in the wrong direction, because a lot of them are really victim blaming, because they're all centered on, they're usually about children, they're all centered on the child as being the one who's doing all of these things in a vacuum away from everything else. You know, they just do these things, and it's because things are bad, and that's where it kind of stops. And it never looks at the role of other people. It never looks at the role of environments or the kind of the social narrative going on around them. It never looks at all the stuff that we're going to talk about in this session, probably. And
I think if I quickly share the infographic that me and you were like, this is very frustrating. I've just, for everybody's, just so you're aware, I have actually blurred out who made it. Now, usually we would like to credit people when they make memes and things like that we share. But because we're not wanting to attack the person who made the meme or the group that made the meme, and it's not, or the infographic. So it's not about, okay, this person did the wrong thing. What we're saying is there's lots of infographics, and this is an example of one, and why we get frustrated. So it's not about, you know, attacking the person who made it or the group or anything like that. So let's quickly just share the example of where we were getting frustrated. Do you want to talk about why we were frustrated with this particular?
Well, firstly, like I said before, it's all centered on it's the child. It's a real victim blaming thing. That's that was my first reaction to this. It's like that this doesn't take into account how this child's being treated by other people, doesn't take into account the behavior, can't take into account anything around kind of suppressing environments or anything like that. This is very, very much focused on social stuff, really, and reaction to social stuff, and it's not incorporating the lifelongness of this, the sensory impact of things, the communication, the behavior, the way that we're pathologized in every way, shape and form, and all of that kind of stuff is completely missing from this, because it's all focused on what that child is doing, not what creates what that child might be doing, because this is only a very snapshot version of one particular way of masking as well.
Yeah, and so, like I say, to be clear to everyone, we are not attacking these sorts of infographics. What we're trying to say is, and like you said, Kieran, yourself, which is that the issue with these sorts of infographics or memes or anything like that is they're not detailed for a reason. They get spread more quickly. It's easier to digest the information. I mean, on Aucademy, we also now have an Aucademy memes group specifically so that you can share memes to find a meme quickly, to educate somebody very quickly. So they have a place, but the problem is that some people will only look at this as information.
Yeah, they get taken as verbatim, don't they? And that's the problem. And there are a lot of parents that fall for this kind of simplistic, superficial narrative and don't know that it goes much deeper than that.
Because what are we looking at here then? So, like I say, there's not enough information or any information about the environment other than the word school. So I guess that in this instance is information about the environment, but it's very, very narrow. So what is it they're trying to convey that we're necessarily having a problem with? So like you said, you've got this idea of, if for people who are maybe on a really small screen, or you need the audio description. So it's kind of a graphic, I guess, of an iceberg. And then you've got the idea that there's things that people can see, so the above the waterline. So you've got what you can see. So well-behaved, hard worker, gifted, compliant, eager to please. And then below the waterline of the iceberg, what you don't see: exhaustion, excessive worrying, stomach aches, a need for perfection, panic attacks, social confusion and anxiety. Anything there you can pick apart?
It's like with the what you don't see, That's completely the wrong phrase, because it's what you're not seeing. So
not
it's not
looking for.
Yeah, it's no, you're not looking for it. You haven't got the understanding or the education or the time to look out for these things within the child. So it's not that the child is hiding all of this stuff, which is what this suggests. It's that the people around that child aren't educated or supported well enough to be able to look for these things within the child. And then you flip over to the top bit, like the what you can see. And like I said before, this is just one way of presenting, of projecting. And when I'm going to do a bit of a presentation in a bit, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but I'm very much of the opinion that masking isn't about fitting in, it's about projecting acceptability. So that's one way that a child could, or an adult could, project acceptability. And there's so much more to that as well, that they're just, that's 5 things.
I guess the acceptability, I think you've talked about it before, but the acceptability could be, I don't know, actually rebelling and lashing out and things. That still could be masking.
It's about fulfilling other people's expectations. So whatever expectation they would have of you, you project that to them. So it could be the class clown, it could be the one that has bad behavior, the one, all of those kind of things. And just because a child is visibly melting down does not mean that they're not masking in other ways as well. So it's, it's too complicated a notion to put on a very, very simple infographic. And when you do that, all it's going to do is make people misunderstand and not understand that there is far more depth to this than is currently being shown.
And again, if for instance, a school looks at this, and a lot of schools, we hear it too often, even when they've been told multiple times via different EHCPs for different autistic students that masking is a thing, and they'll still say, but they're fine at school and all that kind of thing. So the issue, like you say, is that if a school sees this, they'll be on the lookout for that specific 5 things. Whereas, like you say, what about the children that are trying really, really hard to get along with the rebels of the class and things like that? Are they not going to be looking at those individuals as well? So it's just another way to miss more autistic people who are struggling.
And that's the one word that's really jumping out on there, especially in that top half, is gifted. Because what does that even mean? We're all every human being on this planet is gifted in one way, shape or form. So what that's actually implying is academically gifted, I would imagine. So therefore that's then fulfilling the whole compliant, eager to please, well-behaved, hard worker thing, so that's actually a word there that's fulfilling all that narrative that they're putting around that they don't want them to see, so it's
and I was incredibly masked, and I certainly wasn't considered gifted. I was told I couldn't be capable of further education. So it's still very, very problematic. I was just about scraping by, if that, but I was very, very masked. Nobody knew what was going on for me. Okay, so let's stop sharing. Like I say, really didn't want it to, hopefully people understand that we're not trying to attack individuals who make those memes. It's just that they're too narrow, and they mean we are missing lots of different autistic people who might, or young people and pupils that might be struggling. Okay, you are welcome if you would like to. Is it only me that can do it, to share your presentation?
Oh, it's saying to stop sharing, so I'm presuming I am.
I'll do it. Hold on. I have to add it to the stream. This is all new.
It's full screen, so just tell me if you can see it.
Yep, it's there. Fantastic.
Is it there? Excellent. All right then. So I'll skip over this bit because I hate talking about myself.
Can we have the top, because we didn't do the proper, because we've had you on before, but there might be people who don't know you. Can we at least just do the basics so they can find you?
I'm Kieran. Hello. I'm a writer, a consultant, a trainer, a public speaker, and I was given this title the other day by my very good friend Amy Pearson. She called me a rogue researcher because I was very confused as to whether actually now I'm an academic or not, because I have published academically, but I don't work in academia at all. And I don't have a doctorate or a PhD or a master's or anything. So I'm quite happy to take the title of rogue researcher as well.
I like it.
That would actually count for you as well, wouldn't it, Chloe? To a degree, you're not aligned with a university or anything really now, are you? Apart from the work that you do, you're not researching.
And you trump me, because I haven't been published in a peer-reviewed paper yet. Oh, actually, no, technically I have.
I thought you,
but not on anything, not anything autistic related.
Ah, right. Yes, of course. Ah. Oh, I've trumped Chloe. I'm quite happy now.
So I'm going to sit here nice and quietly. I want to hear the presentation.
Okay. So I'll stop talking about me because I'm really not important. If you want to see more of me, my website there, it's theautisticadvocate.com. There's lots of words if you like words. Right. So before we do anything, we have to get this bit out of the way. So everybody masks, but not everyone is the member of a group where their whole existence is pathologized through a lens of behavior and stigmatization, leading to marginalization, othering, exclusion, and a complete loss of self-identity. So if anybody says to you, everyone masks, that's your response, because everybody does mask to an extent. And we have things like context switching, which is where, you know, you go into different situations and you change how you behave because you're around different people. So you might be different around your friends than you are when you're around your parents or your colleagues. Some of us might not be. Some of us might be exactly the same in each of those situations. But usually, generally, there's a level of kind of you act a little bit differently. So this is the response to that, because we are a member of a marginalized group, and the important thing to know about this is that autistic masking is unique to autistic people, but masking in the sense that we're talking about it is not unique to autistic people, but I will go into that a little bit more. So a little bit about what autism research says about masking first. So it's a really quite a new field. It's only 4 or 5 years old. And it's already gone off in directions which really make me uncomfortable. And most of that is framed around these 3 words here: compensation, assimilation, and masking. So academia says that compensation is finding ways around difficulties associated with being autistic. So, for example, an autistic person might compensate for, these aren't my words, by the way, an autistic person might compensate for not knowing which facial expressions to make by copying the facial expressions of a character in a TV show. Okay, so that's compensation. Assimilation is fitting in with other people. So an autistic person, and this is copied and pasted from an actual paper. An autistic person might try to assimilate by always sitting next to the same person in class. That's assimilation. And then we have masking. So they've stolen our word, which the autistic community has been using for about the last 30 or 40 years to describe all of these processes. And also, I forgot to say, all of this is called camouflaging in academia, with these 3 subcategories underneath. And yeah, they just decided to call it something differently to what we call it, because that's what they do. So masking, they say, is hiding aspects of yourself or pretending to be like someone else. For example, a person might mask their autism by pretending to join in a game, even if they don't understand the rules. So as you will have noticed from the little bit that Chloe and I did just before, talking around that infographic, I don't agree with all of this. I agree that some of this and aspects of this are part of something much bigger. So this is when we look at behavioral therapies and things like this, one of the ways that we can discredit things like that is because of the way that they describe behavior and the way that they reduce behavior. So they reduce everything down to 4 areas. All of human existence in behavioral therapy is framed around 4 different areas. So now autistic masking, according to research narratives, is framed around 3 different areas. And it's really, really problematic. It's all framed around social factors, and really with camouflaging, as they call it, as a set of social strategies. And even just that little snippet from the beginning, you'll get a sense now that it goes far, far deeper than this. So if we move on to what the autistic community says, so actually the autistic community has been talking about this for decades, like I said, very early on. If you go back to 1996, I think, is the first mention of autistic masking in a publication written by an autistic person. So that's something that's like stuck in history. And that was Gunilla Gerland, and I cannot remember the name of her book for the life of me. I do have it behind me over on my shoulder. But she talks about masking in the sense that we are talking about masking now, as has been picked up all the way through. Now, there have been notions around kind of fitting in, but I think the interpretation of fitting in has been misinterpreted by the research narrative around this idea that we choose to do this, that, you know, this is an active thing. oh, look, there's a social situation. I'm going to put my mask on and go into that social situation. I'm going to compensate. I'm going to assimilate, and I'm going to mask. And then at the end of that social situation, you can take it all off again and then go back to what you were doing before. Now, over time, what I've seen since this research narrative has come out is that autistic people are starting to talk differently about masking, and they're starting to reflect what's in the research narrative for the exact reasons that Chloe and I talked about with that infographic before. Because somebody puts something out into the world and it's rubber stamped by professors and universities, and it's called research, and it goes out into the world, it goes into services, and it goes into the media, and it goes into our cultural understanding of these things, and people start to believe it. So even as an autistic person, you might know that this isn't quite right, but because that's the narrative that's out there, then that's it, we stick to it, which in a way is part of masking itself. But when you talk to people about trauma, and you talk to people about the fact that they've been doing this pretty much since the day they were born, and you talk to them about the fact that there are factors here which are not taken into account for, which is things like sensory suppression, invalidation, people traumatizing you, people bullying you, people picking on you, and the fact that you are then starting to mask because it's a response to the way that you have been treated and the way that you're having to suppress pain from your sensory self and the way that you're gaslit around those things, people start to go, oh yeah, it's not just about compensation, assimilation, and masking, is it? So actually, this is a really, really superficial narrative, but we're already seeing the impact of this superficial narrative because the people that need not to believe it are actually starting to fall for this. And of course, around us, we have parents, we have services that are starting to frame this as actually what masking is, and it is far too superficial. So what does a wider narrative suggest? This is my definition of masking. I will read it out for those of you that would use screen readers. This has been, actually, Chloe, this has probably changed since the last time you've seen it. And I know you've seen this a few times because I've spent the last 10 years tinkering with this and I'm never happy with it. But this is roughly my definition of what masking is. So autistic masking is a trauma response. It's a psychological safety mechanism made up of complex layers of physical, emotional, and social actions, which an autistic person is driven to use to self-protect and present an acceptable version of who they are. This occurs by applying in fluctuating degrees, often uncontextualized and sometimes rehearsed learnt behaviors to appropriate situations, while simultaneously suppressing both natural behaviors and self-identity, or conversely projecting an exaggerated identity. All of this happens partly consciously, with the person quickly learning to dissociate from the act, and from then on, I've got subconsciously, and I know Chloe doesn't like that, so I'm going to say unconsciously, preemptive, reactive, and unplanned, and all at great mental and physical cost. So that's me trying to conceptualize everything about masking in like 3 lines, which is impossible, which is why I keep having to change it, and which is why I keep kind of picking at it and picking at it and picking it up. I'll never be happy with it, and I'm writing a book at the moment, and I know that this definition is going to have to go into that book. And I don't want it to, because I know that the moment it's like it goes into print, I want to change it. But this is what the wider narrative suggests. And the reason that the wider narrative suggests this is because of what we're going to go on to next. And I know this is like a whistle-stop tour, but Chloe and I really want to talk about all this stuff. So this is why I'm just kind of quickly presenting it all to you. So the reason there is a wider narrative is for what I call trauma bingo. All of these things are part of the masking narrative. They're part of the reason for the masking narrative. Some of them are kind of, you know, the causes, some of them are kind of the action, some of the kind of where it goes and how it impacts on you. And it's all self-fulfilling prophecies, because the more you have these things occur to you, the more that the mask develops and the more it kind of becomes this shell of trauma around you. So all of these things are part of that, and I will read it out. So there's things like internalized ableism, not being included or excluded, marginalization, gender norms, social skills training or social skills normalization, as we have in the wider world, even if you aren't put through social skills training, self-protection, social norms, communication invalidation, being dismissed, the negative narrative of autism, the history of autism that leads up to all of this, which is a massive part of all of this, trauma, fear, othering, sensory invalidation, previous negative experience where you perceive you're going to be treated badly, so the mask just comes out, bullying, fawning, a lack of reasonable adjustment, stigma, a lack of self-understanding, a lack of connection, feeling unsafe, and then just general therapies around us that are trying to normalize us all the time. It's a lot. It's a real lot. But you can understand now why I vastly disagree with those 3 simple social strategies as being masking when it's clearly not. There's clearly a huge amount missing from all of this. So a lot of this becomes a victim blaming narrative, especially when we look at those social strategies, because again, it's framed around behavior, and behavior is a really bad lens to look at us through. Something that's come out of this are things called phenotypes, which are kind of subdivisions of autism. When we're talking about autism, that's what a phenotype is. It's kind of, this is a different type of autism or a different type of thing. So we have this narrative around gender particularly, but other marginalized groups as well, because there is an huge intersection amongst the autistic community of different marginalized groups. So anyone can be autistic. So it doesn't, there's, you know, it doesn't, the borders don't matter, different types of people don't matter in terms of race or skin color or anything like that, or whatever background you come from, whether you're poor, whether you're rich, anybody can be autistic. So there's huge intersection there. But we know that there's mass underdiagnosis in a lot of marginalized groups within the autistic community. So we have this narrative now of phenotypes, and the masking narrative has created an awful one around autistic women and girls. And I'm just going to touch on it briefly because I know this is a real big bugbear of Chloe's as well. So we're going to get into that later. But it's created this narrative that autistic women and girls, firstly, only that group, which doesn't take into account non-binary people, trans people, or people who present atypically autistic, who are the internalizers as opposed to the externalizers. That narrative says that autistic women and girls experience a different autism because of their gender. That's it. And how that's come from the masking narrative is that autistic women and girls are a massively underdiagnosed group. Firstly, that is a cold, hard, stone cold fact. But the masking narrative has impacted on that, because now we have this understanding that the reason that autistic women and girls have been under-recognized is because they mask. So you've been hiding. All you autistic women and girls out there, you've been hiding. How dare you? You're sneaky autistics, and you have sneaky autism because that's made you hide from all these white male researchers who are scurrying around desperately looking for you, and they can't find you anywhere. So what we have here is sexism, and we know that the narrative of autism is massively sexist, but it goes deeper than that. It doesn't stop at sexism, because it's too simplistic to say that it's a white boy narrative, because it isn't. It's a white boy narrative of autistic children and adults who present in a particular way. And it's really important to clarify that, because when we talk about these phenotypes and when we gender autism like this, and we say that there is female autism, that excludes this notion of female autism excludes autistic women and girls who don't present like that. And it excludes autistic boys and men who don't present like that. And it excludes autistic non-binary people and trans people who don't present like that as well. So it's a massively oversimplification of the narrative. And it's come from the same people who have come up with the masking narrative of compensation, assimilation, and masking. It's come from exactly the same place, who happens to be a white middle-class Cambridge-educated researcher who is a man. The name of the female version of autism that they've come up with is the female autism phenotype, which is reduced down to the acronym FAP, which, if you are per se with American vernacular, means something very, very different. You might not want to Google it if you don't like sexual content, which again is ironic because it's a white man talking about women and who has used that terminology. I don't think it's deliberate, but it's uncanny that it's kind of happened that way. So anyway, I'm going to stop getting soapboxing because I will be here all night doing that one. So, whoops, I've gone the wrong way. What we need to see is that different groups don't experience different autism or even mask better, because again, this is framed around socialization. different groups experience different layers of prejudice. But again, that's not how we're looked at. That's not how we're seen. We're not even seen as different groups. We're seen as differently autistic. When we're not differently autistic, we're subjected to different things and have different issues going on in our lives. On top of that as well is that if we start going down this avenue of that there's a female autism phenotype, or that there's a black phenotype, or that there's a Muslim phenotype, or I don't know, whatever, pick your marginalized group and create a name around it, that we are then trying to say that there are actually different brains for these different groups. And that's a whole problematic narrative, especially when you consider that we have spent the last 20 years debunking the extreme male brain theory. And, you know, here we are back again with the extreme, with different versions of extreme brains. We know scientifically there is no evidence. There might be at some point in the future, but right now there is zero evidence of gender brains. So how can there be different autisms? There can't be, because this is about socialization and social constructs. Next one. Where does the mask start? Well, like I've kind of alluded to a couple of times, this really starts in babyhood. If you have huge sensory differences and are born into a world where all of the impact of those differences is going to hit you like a bomb going off, literally from the moment you're born, you are going to be invalidated unwittingly by your parents, by your family, by whoever, because they don't know that you have these sensory needs. So as you grow up, you will find that these sensory differences impact you. You might get to the point where you can complain about them, but quite often you're gaslighted and invalidated because of things like confirmation bias. Well, it's not that bad for me, so it can't be that bad for you. You know, you're going to be okay, get over it, dust yourself off, all of those kind of things that we generally hear around our sensory differences, especially around pain. So over time, as you get older, you start mixing with other people, you learn to communicate in whatever way that looks for you, and you start being invalidated around your communication. You start being invalidated around your behavior. You start being invalidated around how you think, how you feel, how you act, how you move, what you eat, how you eat. Everything in our lives, we are invalidated for. So you think as a baby growing up to a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old, constant barrage of invalidation, and then you wrap that up around socialization in terms of not understanding the games that are going on around you, not understanding how or not able to process quickly enough, or processing too quickly, or all of these kind of things that are going on around you unwittingly for the most part. But you know, there's a sense of ownership here that all of this can't be placed on the individual. We have to look at the wider picture, the bigger picture here, the enormous picture, most of which is not us. You can see how the mask starts to develop. Now, all of us, I would imagine, everyone watching here and commenting and stuff, I would imagine that you have spent a lifetime kind of mostly second guessing yourself, not listening to your own needs, not listening to your own body, trying to push through when you know you really shouldn't or you can't, but feeling like you have to, you've got no choice in that. All of that comes from the development of our mask during childhood. This is trauma. This is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of trauma building up around you. So we get to the point, where does it end? So as you build all this stuff around you, most of us, I would imagine, understand the autistic burnout narrative, where we are working so hard to sustain this mask and exist in this world which is constantly bombarding us with all of these different negative things, and it sucks the energy out of us. So it gets to the point where masking is unsustainable, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about autistic burnout. And then you're looking into things like regression or loss of skills, or when in actual fact, no, it's our brain going into self-protection mode and deciding what's important. I have minimal energy. What do I focus on to keep me alive? That's where we are with autistic burnout. And this is where the mask leads. I don't think Chloe's done her trigger warning yet, but, you know, content warning for suicide and self-harm. We have massively high rates of suicide amongst the autistic community. We have massively high rates of self-harm, not self-injurious behavior, but actual self-harm. Massively huge bouts of homelessness, rates of unemployment, all of those things. And it's all tied into this. But directly, suicide and masking are being linked in research now. Sarah Cassidy from Nottingham University has done research where she's found that masking is an indicator, a lead in to suicide amongst the autistic population, which is a huge thing. I think it's missing a step with the autistic burnout narrative, because that needs to be far more developed. There's only 1.5 papers. The second paper isn't published yet out in the world about autistic burnout. But it's a huge part of the narrative, and it's really, really important that there's much more focus on this. And again, when you look at the masking narrative, none of this is mentioned. So very quickly, is everything masking? Well, no, but like we said when we looked at that infographic, you look at an infographic like we looked at the beginning, and it was all focused on the person. But actually, much of what we think is masking actually isn't masking. So when you talk to parents and they say, oh, my child masks so well in school, actually they probably don't, because I or other autistic people with a little bit of knowledge could probably walk into that school and spot the masking autistic kids, which says that they're actually not hiding being autistic. The problem is that the people around them, their peers, their teachers, parents, whatever, haven't got enough information in order to be able to identify that this is a child in distress. This is a child who is unable to cope. I don't really like that word, but it's a word that we use. That's struggling, that's maybe fawning, that's maybe doing some of the things that's said in that infographic, or projecting in a different way. Because when we talk about masking, we have to remember this is about projecting acceptability. This is not about someone hiding. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't. Often it's about fulfilling the expectations of the people around them. So you walk into a room, you know what people expect of you, so you give them that, because that's safe for them. They're not going to treat you any differently. They might treat you badly all the time when you are like that, but you know what to expect. It's safe. If you start acting differently, they're going to treat you differently, which is unsettling. It's an unknown. So it's really, really important to understand that, firstly, not everything is masking. Often, mostly, it's around other people's lack of knowledge. But secondly, it's not just about fitting in. It's not just about hiding. It's not just about suppressing. It is about suppressing mostly, but it's more about fulfilling other people's expectations. So does the mask have a use? I am going to breathe at some point tonight. Does the mask have a use? Yes, it keeps us safe. It protects us. But it's also a paradox, because the thing that protects us from this world that we live in is also the thing that kills us. We have what I call a red zone in autistic people's lives, which is our average range of death. Now, research indicates that that's between 36 and 54. And the biggest killers of autistic people, secondary to epilepsy, are heart attacks and suicide. You can see the narrative of stress here. So the mask is useful in short bursts, but as a long-term response to everything that's going on around us, no, it's not. It's not useful at all. It's dangerous. But we are encouraged to use it. We are encouraged to be normal, in inverted commas. We are, therapies have been created to make us normal, in inverted commas. So what those therapies are actually doing are encouraging us to mask. They're encouraging us to not be authentic, but to project acceptability. And it gets to the point where that acceptability disappears, is unsustainable. So as I said, as you get into adulthood, or you get into periods of burnout, and you get into later adulthood, it's harder and harder and harder to sustain it, because you're burnt out. You haven't got the energy to manage it anymore. So when we talk about mitigating masking, actually the way that you can make it unsustainable sooner, which is something that you might like to do, is about having control in your life, and is about taking control over who you are with, where you go, whether you have safe exit routes out of situations, whether you have control over your sensory environment and understand your own sensory needs. All of those things can be useful for mitigating it. But there are groups amongst the autistic community which can't have that control. And I think specifically here about the Black community, particularly the Black community in America, but also the Black community in the UK and other countries as well. But I think particularly of America, because policemen carry guns. and regularly shoot people, and even more regularly shoot black people. So if you are a black autistic who is trying to take control, and you're a 6-foot tall black man on a street corner, and you might be stimming away on that street corner, giving a whole good hand flap, and then all of a sudden police turn up and point guns at you because someone's called them because they think you're acting erratically, you are, you know, doing things which normal people don't do. So in that context, the police are going to turn up, and, you know, there's narratives that will spin out in a police officer's mind. So if it was a white person, it might spin off a narrative of this person has a mental health condition. If it's a black person, it will likely spin off into this person is on drugs. And then if you are an autistic person who's stimming on a street corner and someone points a gun at you, you're probably going to get stressed. So your flaps or whatever it is, your stimming might become more erratic, more jerky. Your hands might make more violent kind of movements. So it might look like you're reaching for something. So you are then more likely to be shot. So there is a huge amount of prejudice with mitigating masking. So if you are talking to an autistic person or an autistic child about how they can take control of their lives, you have to be consciously aware of the dangers of doing that as well. So very, very quickly, before I end, yes, that is the last bit. This is a paper that I published in January of this year, that I wrote with Dr. Amy Pearson, who is my academic partner and research partner, and we published this in Autism and Adulthood, and it basically covers all the things that I've literally just covered there, but it's particularly framed around this illusion of choice, because those three groupings, that compensation, assimilation, and masking, are framed around the understanding that this is something that we choose to do, which is why stigma and trauma have been completely left out of the whole narrative. So we published this paper in the hope that it would literally put a doorstop in the middle of this research narrative around masking and make people stop and think. And it's been really, really well received. It's free access, so anybody can go and read it. On my website, there is a blog I wrote called One Day They Will Join Us in the Sun. It's right at the top of my blog, and you can go and read that, which frames this in a bit more kind of simplistic term, because it is written in academic ease, which is really, it's not the way that I write at all. But there's a link to the research there as well. But this has become a hugely important thing for me that we get this right, because it is going out into services and it is causing people to think that masking is just a set of social strategies. And then services get built around these misunderstandings. As we know, around mental health services in anywhere in the world, really, around autistic people, they're rubbish. Mostly they don't exist. And if they do exist, usually it's like, do CBT, because that works for everybody. And it doesn't understand the actual implications of what's led you to that point in your life and what's led you to do these things and the impact of other people on that. So it's just really, really important for me that this changes. And I'm going to shut up now because I've talked for long enough. Oh, and I have a research page on my website as well, all about masking.
You're so self-deprecating, because I wanted this. It's what I invited you on for. It's great. I mean, it's not great because it's distressing and depressing for us to realise the negative narrative and the incorrect and wholly missing the point narrative that exists.
Yeah.
I've made some notes.
I'm not being self-deprecating though, because I don't ever want this to be about, and I talk about this all the time, and I want other people's perspective on this. And I know that you have amazing perspectives on this, and a lot of them align with mine as well. But it's really, really important that this is a conversation. This isn't a set in stone thing. And that's really important for people to know. But when we have narratives like this going out into academia, it becomes a set in stone thing.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's a movable feast. We don't understand anything about human brains at all, really, in the grand scheme of things. So how can we then be as hubristic to think that we can say this is what something is? They put a pin in autism 100 years ago and it's never moved, has it? So, these things have to evolve.
And I think that's one of the good signs of a good researcher or a good academic or just a generally decent human being, which is knowing that we are not, that things can change, that we might have to change our perspective, that it might have to be updated. So there is a number, I've met, I talk about Peter Kinderman often because I've met him and he was a really lovely human being. And I liked the fact that he said he was prepared to be wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that we are wrong. I don't think we are, but in terms of masking, but the point being that we're prepared for it to keep being updated.
Yeah.
And to be honest, the majority of what I understand from masking and things has been filtered through to me via Annette. So sorry, it's like a tick now. We can't help saying Annette. So a number of things that, you know, she taught me, and that then I looked into it. I found obviously your stuff, and we use a lot of your stuff when we do our session on masking, obviously crediting you, but we use your definitions, and we get them to, so what I'm talking about now is the students that we support to work out who they are as autistic people, and we want them to understand what masking is, but from the autistic perspective, because it's not helpful to understand the literature understanding. So I've got a number of notes that we could potentially talk through, but were there any talking points that you had that you wanted to pick apart?
All of them.
All of them. Okay. I'm hoping that these are all kind of things I picked up as you were talking. So if we don't get to one, very quickly, because James is asking, are there also intentional masks once you've learned about masking or after identifying and being diagnosed? Does that make sense? So they're asking.
If I'm interpreting that right, I think that's about kind of using the mask, and once you've got that control, because it's a tool. It is a skill set, but unfortunately, it's a skill set that often takes us over. So, and then it stops becoming a tool or a skill. So I think it's important to know that, see, I ran a social media campaign a couple of years ago called Take the Mask Off, and lots of people, it was the title was too clever because lots of people interpreted it literally, in terms of they had to stop masking. But it was about taking the mask off of autistic masking, which was like too clever. Like more information about masking.
Subject to your own whimsy.
Exactly. I'm too clever for my own good sometimes. I trick myself. So it really, I don't think that you can stop masking, but what you can do is take control. And the more control you have in your life, the more control you have over it, and then you can use it as a skill set. So for example, I have conversations about masking on Twitter all the time. People just like come to me and ask me questions and things, and it sparks off great conversations. But somebody said the other day they were in hospital with a relative and they needed to go and ask for something. And they knew that if they went out and asked in the way that they would normally ask for things as themselves, they wouldn't get a positive response. So they had to put the smile on, put the fake voice on, ask how people were, and go through all these steps that they have no interest in whatsoever. All they wanted was the information, which for an autistic person is what we do. We information exchange. You know, that's why we don't have all the social fluff that goes around with non-autistic people, because we are just swapping info back and forth, and it's great. But that doesn't work when you are dealing with non-autistic people, because they get offended by that and they take umbrage because you're not making them feel better about themselves. And that sounds really us and them, but you know, it's a very simplistic way of saying that that's what happens.
And there is communication differences. I mean, ultimately they do exist. So,
yes. So there are things that can be useful to get you through certain situations. And they're really important to know. I think they're really, really valuable to know, because that keeps you safe. That helps you navigate situations. But when you are doing that all the time, and even when you're not around non-autistic people, that's when it becomes problematic, and that's when it's taken over your life. And when you are, like I said, I do have to take that sub out of there. When you're doing it unconsciously, then that's when it's a problem, because you don't know it's happening. You've dissociated it from it. Your brain's still using all that energy to mask, but you don't even know it's there anymore. So you don't know why you're tired all the time, and you don't know why you've got aches and pains and all of these kind of things. And that's literally because your brain's working overtime constantly, and it's compartmentalized itself.
And I think I want to come back to that as well, actually, because in my sort of comments was about that taking back control. I think that's great. That's really key, because like you say, then it's not the mask is unconsciously controlling you, or, you know, taking away your energy, your spoons, and so on. I know there's a great question from Marsha, but if it's all right, if we can come back to it, because it's slightly aside to what we've been talking about.
It's really important. Yeah, I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely, can come back to that. So I like that idea of control, because I think because obviously being autistic, we can be very black and white. We've become aware of the mask. We've learnt about the mask. We know the mask is bad. We must stop masking. And it's kind of like, actually, like you're saying, if you're the one in control of it, you understand it. What is my mask and what isn't? When do I use it? When can I actually be my authentic self and safe and not use up all that energy masking? That gives the power back to you as the individual. And I think that's important. Annette's actually putting her hand up. Hold on. Do you want to come in, Annette?
Come on screen, Annette. I've missed you. I haven't seen you for 3 years.
This is really impromptu, because Annette should eventually be doing an introduction session, because Annette has been away and not been able to actually be part of Aucademy. So this is a really impromptu, not proper introduction. This is Annette. So whenever you hear me and Si go, Annette, this is Annette. What was your hand up for?
Okay.
No, you got to remember.
I just think that people, because I was diagnosed at 39. So, and discovered really at that exact time as well. I didn't know before. So it took a very long time. That was 10 years ago. And I'm just starting to really know what is a mask and what is me. And I think people can't, sometimes people feel bad because they feel like, I don't know what my mask is and who I am. And I think that takes a really, really, really long time to unpick. And that people need to be kind to themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you actually hear her okay? I forget.
Yeah, I can, but I don't know if anybody else can.
Yeah.
We'll just talk amongst ourselves.
To say as well, you know, and I suppose taking back control sometimes can take a long time to kind of to understand the nuance, because it really does become a part of you, the mask, when you don't even know that you're doing it.
Yeah.
Which I think we all know about, but yeah. That's what I was.
You might as well stay.
Okay, I'll stay.
We'll just pick apart. We'll pick apart the things that I had. So like I say, Annette really was, as much as Annette is again another self-deprecating autistic person, so doesn't acknowledge all the things that actually you've taught me, because Annette was diagnosed before I was, and then I met Annette during my discovery at the beginning, kind of thing. So I very much from Annette understood early on that camouflaging just sounded wrong. It sounds sneaky. When somebody camouflages, they are purposely painting their face or wearing, you know, I just imagine like army gear,
guerrilla warfare,
that kind of thing. And it sounds sneaky, and it's kind of like that didn't make sense on an intuitive level. It's like when I learned about my mask, because I never understood my mask, and then it had until somebody shows it, holds it up to you, which is when you realize you're autistic and you hang out with other autistic people. You know, so then to be told, well, you're doing it sneakily and you've been putting this on all that time, and it's like, really, you think I purposely hid feeling distressed and suicidal and things in my life? I don't think so. So yeah, that idea, and that's why the paper that you and Amy did is really important, because of trying to break down that issue of the illusion of choice.
See, something there, Chloe, as well, though, that I don't think that's the perception, though, that I don't think that they perceive it as us hiding, being traumatized and upset and distressed, and they see it as hiding something, our autism, our bad thing, from them. And because they don't see it as distress, they don't see it as all those things that we're existing through. They see it as a negative part of ourselves that has a negative impact on them. And if we've been hiding that from them, and then all of a sudden we're not hiding that from them anymore, and we're acting differently in ways that they don't like and makes them feel uncomfortable, that's what they're perceiving. I don't think they see it as distress at all.
It's all about behavior again.
Yeah.
So they all autistic people, when we're being looked at by the biomedical model, is our behavior, and not how that behavior happens, you know. You know,
and how it impacts on non-autistic people.
Yes.
And it's like, if you've got a masking autistic person, okay, even if they ignore that it's because we're in distress, that's why we mask out of survival. How have they made it about them? It's so frustrating. It's not about them. Like I said,
it is. Everything is.
I know, it's so frustrating because, like I say, it does make sense that it's a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
And I think also we've got to this stage where masking is being understood more. So, okay, not necessarily in the right way, or just knowing it exists anyway, even if they don't understand really what it is. But I think people have now got to the stage where they believe it's something that happens for, say, teenage autistic women, female presenting, or girls rather, because they're teenagers, female presenting, teenagers mask as if it's something that happens when they go to school only, for instance, or when they're getting picked on for being different and things. And I think to some extent, talking to you, Kieran, made me realise it obviously happens much earlier. And then you talking about babies, autistic babies. Did you talk about that today? I think you did. I was
very briefly, yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that again? Because I think that was huge.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you imagine, all of us individually have very different sensory profiles. But if you consider there might be an autistic baby that has a negative response to touch or light or any of those things, no one's going to know. And the only way that a baby can, especially around touch, I use myself in this scenario. This comes from me, because as an autistic, I have a huge pain response to touch. So when people touch me skin to skin, it burns. So I know from talking to my parents long ago and my older sister and stuff that as a baby, anytime that I was touched, looking back retrospectively, I cried because it was causing a pain response in me. But when babies cry, what happens? They get picked up, they get wiped, they get cuddled, they get touched, constantly. So how does a baby fight back against that and stop that from happening? They can't, because when they're distressed, the only thing they can do is cry. So again, talking to my parents and talking to my sister, it got to the point where I was about 9 or 10 months old, and when people were picking me up, I kind of went ragdoll, like a ragdoll cat, and didn't cry. So I was fawning at that point as a 9-month-old baby, because I was not reacting in the way that I needed to react, which was to tell people that I was in distress, because I knew that telling people that I was in, obviously not consciously, but I knew on some level that telling people I was in distress was going to create more distress for me. So I stopped reacting, which is masking. That's developmental. So if you think of other autistics in that situation with different sensory profiles around different things, similar things are going to be happening, even around things like lights and stuff. And, a baby being born is usually born into the most brightly lit room in a maternity room. Like I've been in them 3 times. They're awful places. They're smelly, they're loud, they're bright, you're surrounded by strangers who are touching you and using instruments on you. So all of the sensory reactions that baby's going to feel, which, yes, babies do have reactions to sensory stimuli, so they're going to feel pain. So that's traumatizing from literally the moment they're born. And then that's just going to be added to and added to and added to and added to developmentally. And then, like I said, as they get a bit older, then it's going to start happening around communication and behavior and socialization and thinking and feeling and eating and moving. And everything we do at some point in our development is pathologized negatively. And then we get invalidated around things like that as well. So it's, get on with it. Everyone else puts up with it, so you have to put up with it. And all of those kind of things that we all hear, you'll get over it. All of that kind of stuff, that's trauma. That's trauma being handed to us. So that's the mask developing. In my head, that's how that happens. That's how that mask develops. And then we have to create all these social strategies as a tiny part of that.
Yeah, and I wonder, actually, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that parents will say, oh yeah, our child was totally neurotypical, and then at 3 years old, all of a sudden they became autistic. And I wonder if that child masked, because what they said was their child mimicked everything that everybody did to them. So that was a mask. And they got to the age of 3.5, and they had their first autistic meltdown, first autistic burnout.
Yeah.
From masking.
Yeah.
For the first 3 years of their life.
Yeah.
And if that because a lot of people said that, especially back in the day, was, oh, it's the vaccines, because all of a sudden, just overnight, my child became autistic. And I don't think that's the case. I think that child masked from the day it was born, and it got to that age, and it it couldn't do it anymore.
I thought, because I did it was supposed to be a bite size. I'm really bad at bite size, so it's like 45 minutes. But I did a bite size Aucademy earlier today to just give people a quick video. I say quick, it is quick to me. But a video on what is autism, again, in just giving people that knowledge of what it says in the manuals versus what is autistic experience. And now I've lost my train of thought. Oh no. What were you just
Babies?
saying?
I was just saying it,
and yes,
I don't know why I was calling a baby an it.
And I made the comment again that we're more likely to be recognised or discovered as autistic people during big periods of change, because there's more to distress us in the environment when there's change. So obviously, like you say, if I mentioned, if you're going from infant school to junior school, that's when somebody will be picked up as autistic. If you're going from junior school to secondary school, if you're in the US, what's the
kindergarten?
You go to middle school, so you go to
middle school to high school.
Middle school to high school.
So basically, those big periods of change, that is usually when puberty, that is usually when you get picked up. Going from home to university, suddenly students get recognised as autistic at university and get a diagnosis. When you get married, when you get divorced, any of those big, periods of change, it's not sudden. It's just you had either a masked autistic or actually a very happy and well supported autistic, and they weren't in distress necessarily. So we don't always have to be masked. It could be that actually the environment was a very autistic friendly one, and they just became distressed at a certain time of change or something.
And even for the 3-year-old that Annette was talking about, at that time, what happens at that time? That's when toddlers are really heavily socialized. That's usually preschool, nursery. That's that period that they start actually being in a kind of a class in a building away from parents. That's a massive transition. So of course there's going to be aspects of skills loss because it is burnout, and that's an obvious thing to me, and I don't understand why that's not being picked up on.
Let's have a look at my other notes. So I just mentioned about the only checklist that we have at the moment for camouflaging is, like you say, it's all about social masking, and it ignores all the other things we experience as masking. So when I saw that, I like the researcher who did it. They're a nice person. They're not autistic. And I looked at that checklist. We looked at it because we was thinking, would this be useful when we do the masking session? Because our autistic students are adults. They're all 18 years plus, some of them 30s, 40s, because obviously university students are all different ages. And they really struggle when we say to them, okay, this week your prep work is to think about what's your neurotypical masked self, and we kind of give them a little bit of an understanding of what masking is, but they really struggle with that. So we thought, oh, there's a checklist, maybe this will help them. And we looked at it and we was like, this is not masking, this is not enough, this isn't detailed, this isn't going to help our students understand what they're masking.
The CAT-Q measures social anxiety.
And it doesn't put into account the sensory experience of autistic
or trauma or any pre-existing or the impact of other people on that person or anything else. It's not again, a conversation on Twitter today I had with someone that where in the CAT-Q does it ask you about why you've had to do these things in order to stop yourself from dying? It doesn't ask that question, and that's the fundamental question that needs to be asked about masking. Like, are you doing these things because you're going to die if you don't? And the answer to that is yes. There's no choice in there at all. But again, the CAT-Q is just social anxiety. That's all it's measuring. But that's a non-autistic person looking at this narrative, who is part of creating this narrative as well, I have to say. I know them as well, and they are a lovely person. But it's superficial, and it's superficial because they don't understand that they are part of the problem.
They still don't understand the motivation. They just see the behavior of autistic
and that's
people.
where we're always going to have a problem when it's an outsider looking in perspective. It's never going to.
They have privilege.
When we saw that, we went to Kieran, didn't we, and asked him for it.
Well,
do you have a list?
we do. We use Kieran's list. We don't bother with the so-called official checklist because it's not helpful. We use your one, and then send them off to your website. Okay, so what else have I got on here? So I made a note about, why did I make this note? So I made a note about when I train, and we get to the why are we seeing more women, non-binary and trans autistics, ? I then have, before we actually do any other slides, I preface it with spoiler alert because of white male researchers. And then I explain masking, but in a non-gendered way, which Annette hates that slide, because what I do is I demonstrate how the literature currently understands autistic women, in quotation marks, and autistic or female autism, sorry, and male autism. And you hate that slide. And she forgets that I'm going to explain that it's wrong and to degender it and things. But yeah, so just because that slide, I just try to show the students, because I think knowledge, giving people the knowledge and empowering them to know what the narrative is that we disagree with is also quite empowering.
I actually changed that slide. Stereotypical male, stereotypical male autistic, stereotypical male.
She always
female
hates that slide. And the point that I'm doing is what I have on there is female, like it's like male autistics. And then there's the what is that? What does that look like in quotation marks? And then what female in quotation marks autism is supposed to look like. And then I explain at the end. But the problem with all of this is that we know men, you know, cis straight men who have that so-called female presentation. It's not a female presentation. It's
not gendered.
No, and it might be that they've got a more internal presentation. Is that because they're masked? Are they masked because, like you say, it's all the different reasons that we might have to survive and what have you isn't necessarily a gendered experience.
No, but we are socialized in a gendered way, and that's why lots of that happens. And I think, I don't know, it'd be interesting to dig down into this more, because I am one of those white male autistics who identify with the female version of autism, if we're going to call it that.
We're not, right? No.
We're not, but you know, but that's what they call it. So I identify strongly with this. So, you know, I could go on to, I don't know, there are lots of famous lists of this is how autistic girls present and this is how you identify, which are useful for autistic women to say, oh my God, I'm autistic. That's absolutely valid, but that's not just about women. And that's the problem. So, but I wonder if I don't present in a stereotypical way because I grew up in a house full of women. Possibly because it's how I've been socialized, you know. So
but there's so much, like you say, because there's so much intersectionality and what have you as well. And I'm just thinking of a number of things actually. I'm thinking of fantastic white cis but gay male who came to see the Aucademy performance and was really tearful at the end, and we asked for permission to hug him because he needed hugs. And it was because he saw himself, but he's not female, you know. There was another thought I had when you were just talking that made sense as well. I've lost it. It's fine.
Well, yeah, I mean, it completely, once again, makes everything binary. So there's only females, there's only males, and what about nothing about the people that are in between? I mean, I consider myself non-binary, and trans people as well. So they're completely left out of the conversation. I mean, I think that's changing now to a certain extent.
And even that's why when I was doing the presentation, I said, you know, that we have this narrative that autism is about white boys, but it actually isn't. It goes even deeper than that. We have to stop with these very statement of fact binary kind of opinions, because it goes far deeper than that, because it's not just about white boys, it's about a stereotypical view of a particular white boy. And that's, you know, we have to stop overgeneralizing these things, because it's really important that we dig into them, because this is how we get all these myths spinning out, and this is how we get misunderstandings, and this is how we end up with researchers coming up with the idea that paracetamol causes autism. You know, but all of this comes out of that. It's all part of that narrative, and it all needs to be unpicked. We need to stop being so simple in our explanations.
I thought that was really good when you said that. I thought, yeah, that's totally right. And I somewhat like, my thesis kind of talks about it being white male cis, but it goes farther than that. You're totally right.
What you're just saying is even narrower perspective. Yeah.
And that, you know, what are we going to do now? Have a phenotype for you know, African American autistics, or, you know, it's just not.
Where does it stop? It's ridiculous.
I think that just before, because I'm going to lose it because it was in my head. I was thinking about, like you said, you might tick the things that are supposed to be so-called female autism. But that's why, for instance, we use Samantha Craft's checklist, but we completely degendered it and made it first person, because it was in the third person and it was is meant to be about girls and women, but we degendered it to use it because it is useful for people who might be more masked presentation and figure out what it feels like on the inside and things like that. It's still not that it's too narrow, because it's very long and it's quite detailed, but it still doesn't cover all the things that we would want to try and help somebody identify they're autistic. But it certainly helps when you degender it. Because we were having lovely, again, cis straight men who were saying, oh, we wanted to come to your social group, but I'm male and it's a female group, and because it used to be before we took it over. And I was like, no, it's not a female group. If you think you'll be comfortable in our group, which is of all genders and sexualities, you are most welcome to join. And they would feel much more comfortable than in some of the other autistic groups that existed.
I do want to make it really clear, though, because I have to be really careful when I talk about these things, because I am a white presenting man, and I don't want people to think that means that I'm like, what about the men? Well, hashtag where are the men, and all of that kind of thing, because that's been thrown at me so many times when I've talked about this stuff, and it's not about that at all.
You're trying to do is defend. I feel that you're actually more on trying to defend and speak up, because we need that. We need people in those spaces where potentially, if you are more likely to get those gigs, if you like, because of whoever's bringing you on, if they're not prepared to, well, I mean, that's a problem in and of itself. If they're not prepared to bring on the people who are being marginalised within the marginalised community, then at least you're speaking up and with the accurate narrative.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, when I started my PhD, I was looking at women, and then I very quickly, within the first month, thought, no, it's got to be women, non-binary, and trans people. But by the end of my PhD, I realized that it's all autistic people, and that, dividing us up into different phenotypes just does not help. I think there's so many similarities within autistic people, and there's lots of differences as well. And I think if some way that we can get the research community to really understand that, and hopefully wider neurotypical society, would be so incredibly helpful for them to understand how diverse the autistic community is. And I think, like you said, we always say this, that, the researchers were looking through a little scope at like a very tiny, minute type of autistic person, and they miss this whole universe of other autistic people. And we can't miss those people anymore.
No.
And that's when we do talk about it, don't we? When we train, we say that, we've had 70 years of a very particular type of like, say, a very, very particular type of white male, blah, blah, et cetera. And then they've moved on to this idea of female autism. But again, they're going to be missing so many types of autistic people because of that very narrow understanding. And gender really doesn't make sense it's a very arbitrary divide for autistic experience of the brain, right? Train of thought. No, I've lost it, so it's fine. There's too much.
Chloe constantly says, I'm not ADHD.
I know.
Constantly train of thought. Oh, look, a squirrel.
It's because I had it and then it disappeared. I really like, that was quite important and interesting what you said. So I made a note about not able to identify, like others, particularly non-autistic people, schools and so on, not able to actually identify autistic people. That is the problem. And so it might not be that the autistic person is necessarily masking, you said. Hopefully I'm not misquoting you. Whereas we are actually quite good at spotting other autistic people. We have been in training with a room full of like 50 people and not really looking at them because we're autistic. Why would we? And just in Tanya. No, Tanya, I don't have attention differences. She keeps also saying I have attention differences.
You do.
I don't. And now I've lost my train of thought again.
Basically, it's
room full of 50 people, and we go,
there's autistic dar, just like gaydar.
Yeah. I've also heard it as neuroscope, which I quite like.
Yes, I like that. I saw that.
Neuroscope's
I really
quite
like
nice.
that.
But we'll be in that room, and afterwards we'll have a chat, and I go, did you see that male presenting person 3 rows back? And they're like, yes. And did you see the so and so in the other autistic? And we didn't even have a conversation with these people. So we're very good at spotting other autistic people, and so it was making me think of, actually, are we masking, or are we just like, yes, okay, we probably are in a lot of instances, but sometimes we're not, and it's just that non-autistic people don't know what autistic experience actually is and could potentially look like. And I think of I think about some of the students when we meet them initially, and I've talked about this before, and they're very, very still and stoic, but they've never met me before. They're maybe anxious and uncomfortable because they're meeting another person, and you see that little stim movement with their hand, and I'm like, anxious autistic person. You know, we non-autistic people would not pick that up, and it's not necessarily that we're masked. So I think that was really interesting.
No, it's completely that, and I think that there's aspects to DAR or neuroscope which are around recognizing each other's body language, because we do have our own intrinsic body language, but also I think there's a kind of energy connection there as well that we plug into other autistic people naturally, rather than neurodivergent people. It's not just autistic people as well. And I think that's a kind of, it probably sounds a little bit woo, but I think we do have energy communication between people and other people and objects and people and animals. Their energy is passed backwards and forwards, and I think we infer that as a kind of through our senses, and that person feels a little bit safer for us because we recognize them, because they match our energy. So I think it's wrapped around that. And so for a non-autistic person, they can't do that. They can't recognize our body language because our body language isn't theirs. They can't plug into our energy because they don't have the same energy. They don't work on the same frequency that we do. And it's simple things like that, but that's enough for them not to see us. But then they come up with narratives around people about being quirky, or they're nerds, or they're geeks, or the non-autistic world has come up with ways of describing autistic people without realizing that they're describing autistic people. But they categorize us as that. So therefore, no, they're not autistic. They're just nerds. Or that person isn't autistic. They just move in a quirky way. Or, or they have a strange way, or they have a strange intonation on their voice, or whatever. It's just completely, confirmation bias just excludes everything.
And so my next note that I made is basically what you've just said, which is not, and again, it's going back to that idea that we're not necessarily masking. It's that people, I put people just not used to recognizing autistic people who aren't the stereotype, a very, very, very narrow stereotype. So maybe we're not masking at all. We're just quirky and so on. And I like somebody said, in terms of that energy and connecting and realizing other autistic people are autistic, for instance, or I can pick up, I'm not going back into it, Tanya, but I can pick up on people who have attention differences. Like I can tell the difference from the communication, and I can instantly go, I'm talking to an autistic person with attention differences. That means I will have to potentially adapt my understanding and communication in this way. And I think frustratingly, we probably meet so many more autistic people than so-called professionals. We train on it, we talk about it, we have friends, we date people who are autistic, we support people in different capacities. We really are getting to know our community that they're just not getting that. So I like Anne Louise's comment. So do you think it's happening at the unconscious level, Anne Louise? The neuroscoping, I just had to bring that up. So Kieran mentioned it in his talk, and it's because there's no such thing as subconscious. There's only unconscious and conscious. And I get very frustrated as a psychologist about the word subconscious. Sorry. We do like to be nerdy about our things.
But to answer that question, yes, people can detect, non-autistic people do detect us unconsciously. Because there's Narcissus On's done research into this about the thin slice judgments, in terms of non-autistic people, when they are around autistic people, even if they know we're autistic or not, inherently treat us differently and usually negatively. They usually hold at us arm's length, where when you flip it around, autistic people in those situations generally try to please the other person and try to make them feel comfortable. So there's a natural, that's how we naturally act. And the non-autistic person takes a step back. So we're constantly chasing. So yeah, so which is really kind of uncomfortable when you think about it.
Because we're a different energy.
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking about it, they see us as different and therefore bad. You know, it's that
Careful,
kind of
yeah.
almost, yeah.
And we do,
whereas I think we probably see them as different, but also we have this problem-solving brain that wants to find out why.
We're accepting of difference because we know inherently that we are. So we're much more accepting of other differences of people that is different from ourselves. So
it just makes me think about when you do meet another autistic person and you just tune into that, oh, they look uncomfortable, how can I make them comfortable in this situation? Like we just, so it does, it's, I won't name them, but I'm just thinking of that one academic who is neurodivergent and really lovely, and they get really uncomfortable about talking face to face with people. So you end up almost talking, and you kind of do it naturally because you're like, I'm getting this impression they're uncomfortable. So you almost talk facing the same direction. So that they feel more comfortable, but you just do it naturally.
Or well, they move so that
facing away from you.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay, what else have I got on here? Oh, yeah. So the bit about the taking back control. So that was really important and interesting. So I made the note that you're basically saying, and I agree, and I know you'll agree as well, that there are very few people who can be openly autistic, basically, and be safe. Who can potentially take back control of the mask, for instance. So I put here as a note, who are those people who can be safely openly autistic? Not in the sense, though, that we won't necessarily still be marginalized, oppressed and so on, but safe in the sense of maybe...
Yeah, that is a tough one because, you know, within a work situation, it might not be... I mean, I guess it would be safe, but you might lose your job. So,
So my note was potentially white women and small white children is probably the only ones who you could consider to potentially be safe to drop their mask. Because I'm thinking, I've written about this too, and also even with just Sai. So Sai, Northern Naughty, is, you know, white male, and he can't stim in public, you know, because people will pull their children away from him and things like that, and that's horrendous. That he has to feel like that just because he's a white male with a beard, you know. And absolutely, I really feel for Black people of color who really can't be, particularly men, like you say, who can't be openly autistic for fear of violence, you know. So I think that, like you say, that importance of, for your own self-worth and well-being, being able to take back control of the mask, and or at least understanding it and being authentic in some capacity. So I made a note about, we've talked about this before, which is that when we explain to our students we're supporting, who are all, you know, different genders, different ethnicities and so on, and we're explaining to them what the mask is and that how important it is to learn to be comfortable with your authentic self in authentic spaces and so on. And we explain that even if they can only do that in the 2 hours they're with us
once a week,
that seems to be enough, because some of them, it has definitely been, they've only been able to do it for those 2 hours.
And maybe not even for the full 2 hours because they slip back into it again. I mean, it's so
ingrained. But we do see that just that 2 hours of being in a space that's safe for them to be authentically them, whatever gender or sexuality or ethnicity, seems to improve their well-being. And so I think that is where we come back to my whole thing that I'm really dedicated to, so which is the importance of fostering a positive autistic identity, and culture, community and space. But it's the spaces
where we can be
where
safe,
you can do that. And we use your quote, which is, if you can drop the mask safely, do it. And was it flapping their faces? I can't remember. One of your quotes that we use. It's literally something. It's literally
I don't even know.
Like, if you can do it safely, do so, and, you know, take the mask off and like flap in their faces or something like that. I can't remember. I love it.
It does take a really long time to figure that out. I mean, figuring out your sensory experience. I mean, even like things like lockdown has made my, you know, going back out into the world again and really realizing how loud and bright and uncomfortable it is for me, how much more I need to protect myself on a daily basis, where I just wasn't doing it before. because I just didn't know how intense it was. You know, like you said, you mask that your whole life and you're totally unaware of it.
And I've just seen Bobby's comment as well, which is that because Bobby, openly autistic person, does training, does lives, and they're saying could never stim publicly. On a live, yes. When training others, yes. But out in like a store or pub or whatever, nope, never ever. And again, it's like, what is it that means that we're not safe to do that? Because I will, and I'm a small white woman with a shaved head. I can walk around my Audis and grab the stim objects that I grab, and I'll walk around shaking them and things because I'm stressed in that environment. You know, I'm thinking of I teach with my stim objects and things like that. I'm in a position of power in some respects because I'm the academic and I've got students. They're less likely to.
That has to do with confidence, I think, as well.
I don't feel threatened.
Maybe it's around maybe it's around perception as well, because I think a lot of how we feel is how we perceive we're going to be treated based on previous experiences. So if you know that you're going into Audi or wherever and you don't have a perception that people are going to point and stare or grab you and pin you down or whatever, or call the police or all of those kind of things, which is what happens to lots of people, then if that's not your perception of what's going to happen, then that enables you to be a little bit more confident maybe about it and not even have to think, you know, it's a bit of privilege in a way, because that's something maybe you don't have to think about, you know, which is really what privilege is. But our privileges are the things we don't have to think about because they're not consciously negatively impacting us. So maybe
about them though, because because of that empathy, I think about, like I say, the time that Si explained to me that he felt really uncomfortable because he was stressed in a supermarket with his noodle, stringy noodle, and he felt really sad and uncomfortable and had to hide because a mum pulled her child away. So when I do walk around, I'm thinking about that too, and I'm consciously, constantly making myself aware that I am privileged to be able to do that and not feel at threat of violence or bullying or being kicked out or anything like that. And that's, I mean, because the recent article that I did for LSE, you know, I said that in there, that I know that I'm privileged, and that's why I'll continue to blooming do it as well, though, because I have to keep doing it, even if it might threaten my career, I said in this article, because ultimately that's what gives me meaning in life, to be able to make it easier for Black people, for men, for, you know, because we like you said, you kind of in a joking way, like, what about all the autistic men? But actually there is an issue for autistic men or male presenting people, because they might be perceived in a threatening or a threatening way and so on. And so actually we still want to talk about the autistic men too.
We have to talk about everybody.
We want to talk about everybody.
This is the thing, that this is there are so many different intersections and issues and narratives around all of this, and you can't ever pick a subject about autistic people and stick to it, because it broadens, because everything's so closely connected. And I think, but that's also partly indicative. I get really frustrated if I have to do like a radio interview or something like that. I get really frustrated because it's like 3 questions, you can only talk for a very short period of time, and you have to stick to the subject. You can't go off the subject. And I can't do that, because you can't talk about one little thing, because so much else is part of that one thing that you have to talk about all of the things. So, you know, and it's, you can't, if you are talking about autistic women and girls, fundamentally important, because they are an under-recognized group who are under-recognized for very specific reasons, but we're not talking about those reasons. We're talking about reasons that we've made up. Not us, obviously, the wider population. But you can't talk about autistic women and girls without talking about autistic men. And then you can't talk about autistic men and autistic women and girls without talking about autistic trans and non-binary people. So you can't have a conversation about one group without incorporating all the others. And then obviously you talk about autistic women and girls, and there's intersectionalities within that group of Black autistic women and girls and brown autistic women and girls, and so on and so on and so on. It's
physically disabled and so on and so forth. And
poor, rich, it's all part of the same narrative, that all those people are experiencing different things within the same subdivision of that narrative. And
but apparently we're very black and white thinkers.
Don't see the big picture. But no,
We're not.
that's us looking at the small details, though, isn't it?
Yeah, we're looking at the connections. We see all the connections and that intersectionality. There was an interesting comment about desensitization. So what have I put here? Issue: appearing desensitized is not the same as being desensitized.
Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on that because like you just said, and I've made the comment as well, is I've realized my protective bubble is a healthy bubble. So I was actually having this conversation with Sonia the other day, Sonia Bouet, about how my bubble, where I don't leave the house and I only go out once a week to go food shopping and things like that, I've managed to make that work for me as an autistic person. I have meaning in my life. I still work from home. I do my lives with like fantastic people here. I've made my bubble a good autistic bubble, but that's not the case for all autistic people.
No.
But what that's meant is I've realized how constantly hypervigilant and how greater my anxiety levels were constantly, because now I know that this is actually a much calmer me than probably I've had in years. I do need to exercise. There's some issues, right? I do need the sun. I'm taking vitamin D tablets. So there are some issues, right? But
you're just describing my life at the moment.
Yeah, right. But when I go to the supermarket, I realise it's really much more overwhelming. I do definitely need my earplugs more. I go when it's quiet at night and I take my stim objects and I'll walk around and do stimmy things and stuff like that. We do not become desensitized. We just hide so appearing, I made the note, appearing desensitized, i.e. masked, is not the same as being desensitized. I don't think you can desensitize.
Well, yeah, and you are described by your behavior. So you might be described as spacey or quirky, or I have face blindness when I'm out because the sensory world is so too much for me that I just can't see anything. I can't do anything when I'm out. I don't see people I've known for years. I don't, and people just they describe that experience. They say, oh yeah, you're just a bit spacey, you're a bit, quirky. They don't see it as actually it's in relation to our sensory experience of the world.
Yeah.
I've because of becoming much more aware of my masks since obviously realizing I was autistic and what masking actually is, I now pay much more attention to myself in certain situations. So when I'm at the checkout, I actually do space out and I leave it to Louis to do the packing because it's too much. Like that, even in my head, you've now got the plastic divider thingy, obviously because of COVID and stuff like that. The beeping, I'm worrying about that we're taking too long for the person behind us. Louis is like obviously in Audis they chuck the stuff at you, and I refuse.
That terrifies me. That's why I don't go there, because it terrifies me.
But I refuse to do what you're supposed to do, which is put it all back in the trolley and then pack it on the side. I refuse. No, you will wait until we packed it here because it's just more work, right? So in my head, I just start to zone out, and I think the poor checkout woman thought I was staring at her, but I wasn't. I was just checking out. As in my head, and I'm making myself more aware of that and realizing I am uncomfortable and I'm not good here, whereas in the past I probably wouldn't have thought about it, right? And actually that's good. It means that you're making yourself aware of the issues, and then that means that I'm more likely to. I remember I was going around with the balls that I love that they always have in Aldi. She's going to go grab them. They're like, if you go in Aldi's, their tactile is fantastic for autistic people. I love the tactile.
Oh, we've got loads of those balls.
So not everybody loves
the tactile. So I picked up a load of these, and I was walking around, and because I was getting overwhelmed, I'm walking around going like this the whole way around because it's lovely. Right? Can everyone hear that? It's great. So I'm just walking around, grown-ass woman, doing this, and I get to the checkout, and I give her the ball thingy, and I said, "Can you give it back, please?" And she was like, "You want it back?" I was like, "Yes, I want it back." And I just stood there while Louis did the packing, going. Because I was like, I am safe to do this, and again, privilege, but I'm not going to hide my need to stim. That's really gone off on a weird tangent now, but we can't be desensitized. We can be traumatized from attempts to desensitize us.
Yes, I agree completely.
If we could be desensitized at 37, I would still have hair. If it's taken me 37 years and I still cannot stand having hair on my head, I cannot be desensitized
No.
to no.
And you know, again on that as well, I'm nearly 42, and I let my kids clamber all over me and touch me in any way that they need to touch me, and it still hurts. So that's 42 years of letting people do what they needed to do in order to make them feel comfortable, and it still hurts.
Yeah. So for anyone who thinks that you can be desensitized, you can't.
No.
Audi is a terrifying shopping experience. I know there were some questions right very early on, so if you're still here and you
fawning, wasn't it? Fawning was the question.
I've lost it now, I'm afraid, but I think it was just to talk more on fawning potentially as a masking. If I can find it, I will. But if those people are still here and they had questions that we said we'd come back to, would you mind reposting them? Having a quick flick through.
Come on.
So many.
There is. It's been good chats going on. There was a lovely jokey amount of chats when you mentioned about FAP.
FAP.
I'm presuming everybody knew what it means. I didn't put a trigger warning. We didn't actually do the trigger warnings, did we? So, and I didn't do a trigger warning for sexual stuff. So I didn't want to just blurt out what it was.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah, family friendly show.
Somebody just said, yes, I'd be interested to hear about fawning too. So where's the original? Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Have you got it?
Would like to understand more about fawning. Is there any autistic-led research about it?
I don't think there is.
I don't think there is.
I mean, given we only had the very first paper on burnout, autistic burnout, the only paper that exists came out last year.
Yeah.
You know, they're very
There
behind.
is a second one coming out this year, though.
And I know, but that's the thing. It's like trains or buses.
I know, exactly.
Yeah, which is good to a certain extent.
If it's down the right track.
Yeah.
Like, this is Kieran's point, obviously, and our point, and everyone's point is that, you know, okay, they jumped on, oh, women can be autistic. And then they've gone off on that tangent, and it's kind of like, no, you're still getting it wrong, you know. So oh, and Bobby's asking, please do more on fawning.
Okay. So the best way to describe hold on, take a drink, I'm losing my voice now.
Yeah, and I've just got, isn't Kieran's recent paper on masking a good one though? Yes, it's a very good paper. Because you talk about
quoted it in my thesis.
Because you talk about masking is related to safety, which is what fawning is basically.
Yeah,
but like you say, there's a multitude of tactics and skills and tools and things relating to masking.
So if you think about an autistic child at school, so the child that we had in that infographic right at the very beginning, that's a fawning child. I'm not sure about the thing about them having super skills or whatever it was, but the fawning aspect of that, so fawning is people pleasing. So it's when you do things to make other people feel better and comfortable, and that's something that lots of autistic people do. But in a masking autistic, if you go back to that notion of energy, so I have huge issues with identified with attachment disorder, particularly autistic children, because I think it's really what we're talking about there is about energy. So you have someone who's with a family member, mum, dad, whoever, who they are super safe with, they feel super comfortable with, and then mum, dad, whoever takes them to school, and then they have to detach from them. So they're plugged into that safe energy, and they're feeling safe and they're feeling good with that person, and it's okay. And then you have to unplug them from that and put them in a building where they have to find something else to plug into. In a school, there's nowhere to plug into. So what are you going to do? The nearest thing that you can plug into is the nearest person with authority who is going to protect you in some way. So you're going to try and plug into them. And how are you going to plug into them? Well, you are going to want to make them feel good, because if you make someone else feel good, they'll feel good about you. You're going to want them to like you. So you're going to want to please them. You're going to want them to do all the things that make them feel good about you. So that could be the teacher's pet, the kid that wants to do all the jobs, the kid that sits and puts their hands up, throws their hands up in the air when they know the question and bursts unless they've got, they're able to give the answer. And then if they're not picked on, they're the one that also deflates actively as well. But it's all about pleasing. So when teachers get kids like that, They like that because that's good, because you've got a mini teacher. So what does that mini teacher do for you? That mini teacher validates you as a teacher. They're the one that's hanging on your every word, which is what you want from a child. So as a teacher, because you want them to learn, you want them to take everything on board. And if someone's actively paying attention to you, they're listening to you in non-autistic terms. So what does the teacher do? The teacher encourages that. The teacher gives them the jobs. The teacher wants them to be pleasing and wants them to do the things that because the teacher infers that the child wants to do these things because that makes them feel good. So you have this reciprocal relationship where one's trying to please the other and actually neither is pleasing the other at all. So that's what fawning can look like in that environment. But what that does is encourages that child to become uber compliant. In a way, it's a type of grooming, because basically what you're saying is, I'm going to validate you by giving you things that you want to please me, so I'm therefore going to please you. So if the child thinks that pleasing adults is a good thing, the child is then vulnerable to pleasing adults in lots of different ways. Massive trigger warning. This can make us really susceptible to physical, mental, and sexual abuse, because it's all around, here is an authority figure in my life, I'm going to do what they tell me to do. And generally, children look at adults as authority figures. So that means we do whatever we're told. That means we go out of our way to make them feel better. You can see where this is leading. And it's really uncomfortable and it's sickening. But adults in those figures of places of authority don't see how this can be a negative, don't see how encouraging this actually can have massively negative long-term effects on that child's life as they grow older and are in unsafe situations where they feel like they have to please other people because they've been encouraged to please other people. And it all comes back to that energy and not being able to plug into someone who's really safe. As adults, as parents, as a parent, I know lots of other parents and lots of other adults, whether we're parents or not, and all of us have issues around boundaries and about not being able to say no to people and being uncomfortable in certain situations, but feeling like you have to stay there, and not liking certain people and feeling like you have to still put up with them and please them. All of us have issues around that. So then what do we do to our children? We are now teaching our children to do the same thing. So someone said something to me the other day about, we don't bring up children, we bring up adults. What are we doing? We are bringing up adults who have the same issues with boundaries as we have. And that's really problematic.
So and this is why I say boundaries was the biggest thing to learn as a 36-year-old last year. You know, I always thought I was relatively good with boundaries, but actually, yeah. And I think that is one of the things, that's one of the, no, it's not going to help everything, but I think in terms of masking and actually the very vulnerable young autistic people in the world, you know, boundaries will mean that their needs are being met, which means they're less likely to have to mask, less likely to put themselves, and when I say put themselves, I don't mean obviously like blaming them, but they're less likely to be in dangerous circumstances and positions.
Teaching children that they can say no, I think, is huge.
Yeah.
I think, you know, looking back at my, you know, it wasn't just adults either. It was your peers, you know, that you, I wanted to do everything to make people like me. And that was to the detriment of my mental and physical health.
Absolutely. I mean, looking, and again, a Twitter conversation. I was on Twitter a lot today. I'm often on Twitter anymore, but I was actually on there a lot today. And we were talking about friendships growing up and about how we were treated by other people. Now, my friendship group around me was, looking back, it wasn't a friendship group at all. It was a group of children that I got put in a classroom with at the age of 4. And was in that with that same group of kids all the way through school. So we were very, very familiar with each other, shall we say. But at the time I perceived it as friendship. You know, they were kids that I did things with and went places with, but they treated me awfully. I was always the one that was I was the one that had to look after everyone. I was the reliable one who would make sure that everybody got home okay, but also I was the butt of all the jokes. I was the one that was put upon, the one that had to go out of their way to please other people. If I tried to set a boundary with anyone, I was knocked back immediately and made to feel awful about myself. And I had that from the age of 4, really up until I was like 18, 19. And I thought these people were my friends, but actually they were just people that I stuck with because I was told that they were my friends, and I thought that's what friendship was. And I had no boundaries with any of them at all. They used me completely, and that was my experience of friendship growing up.
I think we need to do a whole other one on boundaries again as well. Like boundaries is huge.
Friendships and relationships.
Yeah, and I'm just at that point now where I'm like, these are my boundaries. I've explained them. If you cross them a number of times, or they're ones that are really, really important that can't be crossed, I'm not putting up with it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's not about that person. I'm not necessarily thinking that that person's evil or bad or anything like that. But I'm just at that point where I'm like, no, my needs are too important now to allow that to keep happening. Yeah. We need to do a whole one on boundaries. Okay, so I've realized the time as well, and I know that I've got hungry people. So masking, it's just not as simple and straightforward and sneaky as the literature would like us to believe.
Yes.
And like everything else, you know, look into it more. It's so much more complex, and then that means we can understand autistic people as complex human beings, as opposed to these people who are sneakily camouflaging their autistic experience from non-autistic people.
Could I do a very quick plug?
Of course you can.
Yeah.
Thank you. I run my big training about 3 times a year online, and the public version. And it's starting on the 16th of June, and you can sign up on my website. We have lots and lots and lots of professionals, but we haven't got many parents, and we want more parents because we have a lovely balance of parents, autistic people, and professionals when we do the discussion aspects of it, and it's a really good mix. So if there's any parents out there that would like 14 hours of training for 40 quid, please come and sign up.
Nice. You can always send us a link, and we can post it out on the main page for people so they actually know. So thank you very much, lovely people, and thank you, Kieran and Annette, for her debut, which was rubbish because I was going to do a whole let's introduce you to Annette, and she's just stymied it.
Typically autistic introduction.
You can still do it.
I know. Just pretend you never saw her, everybody. So next week we have the wonderful Jodie Izzet on, and we're going to discuss pathological, in quotation marks, but basically the demand avoidant profile. So she's going to come on, do a bit of education about potentially how we might support autistic people with that different profile, because that, you know, the demand avoidant profile, we'll talk about the language because the language is a problem. We want to be able to reclaim the language so that it's not in that sort of negative pathologizing way, but people know what I mean at this point in time if I say PDA, I guess. But yeah, how might we support those individuals? And because Tigger, our lovely Tigger, does lots of training on this topic too, he's going to join me for that session. So we're going to do about PDA next week. So yeah, thank you so much, Kieran.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
I hope, like, career-wise, nobody ever looks at half my videos because there's just me like a pervasive drive for autonomy. Lovely, Tanya. Thank you. That. Yes, we'll definitely pick up on the language and what we could actually use instead, but that's a great one. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Bye-bye.